Welcome to my, I guess, 10th iteration of the church history class. Um, my first attempt to do this had no sound, so we're going to try this again. So there will be no audience participation, unfortunately, but hopefully I can get to the information and still make it interesting. This is the 9th century or the 800s, and our three great trends this time are going to be the Vikings. We touched on them briefly last time, but they begin to make inroads into Europe and are a key part of the history of Europe from this point on. Second thing is going to be Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire. Really not since the 300s and the changes that came down has anything so monumental happened in Europe, and where this really is only the beginning of something much bigger. Still, it starts what will become later on the High Middle Ages, really. Europe finally has a vision for itself. Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire are the crystallization of that image of self. And the new evangelization. Evangelization used to be about individuals heading out to countries and learning, and people from the nations going back and evangelizing. And you had people like St. Patrick and Brendan the Navigator and Hilda of Whitby. Those days are over, and Christianity is becoming an institution, and Christianity is becoming almost a colonizing force, going in with the monks and the structure they have, and it's probably far more efficient. In fact, it is more efficient, but it's going to lack some of the touch that the earlier centuries had as far as evangelization. The Vikings. We began the story of the Vikings in my last presentation. With the 800s, they expand their territory and influence in earnest. Vikings originate from northern Scandinavia, as opposed to the Anglos and Saxons who originated in lower Scandinavia. This is a land of real beauty, waterways, mountains, and lush valleys, plus the haunting and fascinating northern lights, or aurora borealis. Here's Scandinavia, as you can see here, the upper part of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, not so much at this point in time, but you can see that area right there, which is Scandinavia, the isthmus and such, the northern part of Europe. There's a closer view, and you can see now Sweden, Norway, and Sweden, which have generally been two nations, although they have had kings who've united them, but they're generally speaking smaller kingdoms, kind of similar to the way you might see in Scotland with the individual tribes, or even in Greek or Greece with the polises, a certain independence among the various tribes and cities in this area. There was a mostly common language and mostly common culture, but there certainly were individual flavors and distinctions among the various areas. The area is beautiful, known for its waterways, the fjords, its valleys, its greenery. There's a series of Vikings, which I will use some images from in the not too distant future, which goes into relatively good representation of what the Vikings were like. But the area they lived in was really quite beautiful. And of course, the northern lights. These kind of I don't even know what causes them, but they happen at certain times of the year, and you can see these dancing lights and such. Very beautiful and really quite a picturesque and lovely area. So Viking villages were an interesting thing. The main village was replete with shops and places where craftsmen labored at their work. At the center of the village was a longhouse, which was an important building of the village where the main community meal was taken. The longhouse was also where governmental business was done by the Jarl, or Viking lord. If you look in English, you'll find that in France and Spain and such, they have counts. Right below the duke is a count. In England, you don't have counts. You have earls, which comes from the Viking Jarl. So the Viking influence shown into there. The longhouse was very important in the Viking culture. Most of the meals were taken there, and I'll cover this in a second. But individual farms was where the livestock was raised and such, but rarely did they eat or do any business there. They came to the towns, which were relatively close to the farms, and the longhouse became the center of Viking culture. In the longhouse, you can see here the center of the cooking pit where the meat was generally cooked, or the vegetables, which were often more root vegetables. It was colder in that area. And there was the place where the Jarl would sit with his court or notables or visitors and such, and very much a community spirit took place. You can see on the wall the shields of the various, smaller clans. They didn't use the word clan. I don't know what word they used. The various areas in Scandinavia. Here's another example, the long table there where they would sit and eat their meals. Oftentimes, again, community meals were eaten at least one, probably almost every day, necessarily, obviously, depending on the needs of the season. And the left, you can see just an example of what kind of the longhouse. It was long, so there were a number of areas within there, some subsections where you could do things. You could have, they would drink, they would feast, they would do business and things like that. And obviously, in cooking. Here's a image from the series The Vikings, and it's probably not too far off from what they actually looked like, with people standing, mulling around, sitting, eating and drinking, carrying on either gossip or business of the village. And again, this was where much of the community life took place. Individual farms were generally the province of a family, and you wouldn't have a lot of activity taking place there. The Jarl, again, this is from the series The Vikings, the Jarl and his court would sit there, his queen, his notable visitors and kind of stuff. You could be called up and asked to do business or seated at the Jarl's table if you were a notable. And here's an example of this. When you're bringing back the booty from a raid, you'd bring it up and you'd present it in the longhouse to the Jarl in front of his court and receive praise or even condemnation right there in front of everybody in the village. Individual farms were located around the outside of this central village area with the longhouse and shops, and usually included the individual dwelling place, storehouses, and things like that, where the livestock could be raised, or a blacksmith shop where you would do your work and such there. They tended to be much smaller, and an individual family would be there, and they would be kind of scattered around the outskirts of the central area of the village. Here's a later one. You can see the architecture there, very Viking looking. I don't really know that there were some areas that were wealthier and some areas that were not wealthy. Plus, the interaction with Europe and the continent allowed them to even more fully develop their own sense of culture and of iconography and kind of architecture and such. Obviously, again, there were wealthier and there were poor areas. Here's an example of a much poorer one. Could also be earlier in the period. Again, as trade and everything began to increase, you're going to see an increase in the wealth and the characteristics of the individual farms and villages. The Vikings were people raised on the ideologies of war. Their society was based on a warrior code, and their deities of their mythology were the gods of war. They had farms and raised animals primarily, and crops secondarily. But their real passion was for battle, pillaging, and raiding. By the beginning of the 9th century, they had colonized all of Scandinavia and the islands of the North Sea. So beginning in the 9th century, these Vikings began to make excursions to England, Ireland, and France. You can see here on the right-hand side the various islands and such of northern Scandinavia, and the flags of them there. Those areas were all colonized with little colonies, almost like the Greeks would with their little polises and such. And by the beginning of the 9th century, most of that area, which was relatively poor, it was isolated. You could start farms, but there wasn't a lot of wealth up there. And so, as the population grew and they ran out of space, young men would go off and they would set up little enclaves or little settlements, and the women would join them in the settlements and such. But again, there wasn't very much. It was mostly farming and relatively poor. The Viking boats could travel a long way. The Vikings learned the art of seafaring very well, and by the 9th century were able to take their boats and go great distances. Leif Erikson is the first one said to have arrived in America and established there, and you can see it traces of was a Viking settlement there. So their ability to travel over distances on the sea was quite astounding, and that allowed them very easily to make inroads into Europe. But Viking warriors used the techniques of Germanic peoples: ferocity, surprise, and blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The Vikings showed up unexpectedly, fought with savagery and bravery, and were gone again almost as fast as they came. This strategy terrorized the lands of England, France, and Ireland. For most of the next century, these peoples lived in fear of Viking raids. The Vikings fought with little or no armor. It was this a northern idea. It was the savagery of what you attacked, and armor weighed you down. And since they were into be moving very quickly, oftentimes again they would paint their bodies and such, and they would go in there. There are some people who say that they believe the gods would protect them and such. I don't know how true that actually is, but it is true that the northern country's speed and ferocity was valued much more than wearing armor. Armor did come in a little bit later. Especially you have what they call berserkers or berserk or bear shirts would cover themselves in the skin of animals, which provided some protection from weapons, but not that much. But primarily gave them the animal, the wolf in particular, but bear also. They would put this on and assume the characteristics of this animal and its fierceness and fleet fast and such like that, allowing them to become more courageous and better soldiers. When Vikings did wear armor, it would again often animal skins or leather. So one of the things about this here is that the Vikings would come in and the Viking crafts were very, very shallow, and they could come up the rivers where the individual cities were in Europe. Most European cities were back a ways because it was harder to get into the rivers to navigate to get to London or to Paris or these areas. Viking ships were set very high on the water and allowed them to navigate these rivers, which made these cities vulnerable to Viking attacks. And the Europeans were quite shocked by this fact. Viking shield maidens, the women, were they trained to do battle? Yes. Did they go on the raids and fight in the wars? No. They protected the villages and homesteads and later on the settlements, but they did so with the ferocity of the Vikings. They were trained to fight as Vikings were trained. They wore the paint and such, and they had the same warrior philosophy as their men had, but no, they did not go off on the raids to England and such. Again, once a settlement was established, and I'll go into that in a moment here, women were absolutely there, and they were absolutely ferocious. And if anybody tried to make inroads or attack villages, they would find themselves confronting very well-trained women, but they did not go off on the boats and everything else. They protected the homesteads, again, with ferocity. The Viking settlements. How this worked was that when the Vikings would arrive on a coast, they would do the raiding in the area. But once that area had been raided, they would begin to look inward. And pretty soon they got far enough in that they couldn't retreat back to their boats and sail away. They had to stay. So they'd establish a settlement. And the settlement was a miniature Viking village. Had a couple of houses where the individual families would stay, would have a longhouse. They brought a small piece of Scandinavia to wherever they were settling. They became big settlements in England very quickly, and all along the coasts again of England, Scotland, Ireland, and again northern France, you're going to see Viking settlements. The Vikings would make inroads and make raids, but again, pretty soon they got far enough in that they could not just leave all of a sudden, so they would set up a settlement. And that way they could take refuge in their settlement. And again, the women would come and they would begin to live their Scandinavian lives on the coast, especially the east coast of England and areas around Ireland. This became so big that in fact the Danelaw was created. And I'm also scooting ahead a few centuries because this takes some time to develop. But eventually the Danes make so much inroads into the northeast of England that the area is eventually called Danelaw, and the kings of England will make peace with the Danes and leave them that area, and it will establish and remain Danelaw for quite some time. So the Viking settlements grow, and that whole area ends up becoming a Viking area of England. Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire. This was Europe finally deciding to reestablish itself as an empire. For The east was where the Holy Roman Emperor, the Roman Empire, pardon me, the Roman Empire was had gone from Rome over to Constantinople under basically Constantine. Diocletian was the first one to move it. But ever since Constantine, the emperor, had reigned from Constantinople in the east, and the west was a tributary. And slowly but surely, with the German invasions and such, the west became weaker and weaker. The creation of Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire was an attempt at Europe to reclaim its sense of itself. Like into the events of the 4th century, the 300s, the crowning of Charlemagne was a watershed moment in church and in European history. The Eastern emperors were unable to provide either leadership or military support to the West. This left the West in desperate need of order, structure, and might. Charlemagne, the son of Charles Martel, was chosen on account of his leadership skills to become the Emperor of the West, a title that had been dead for almost 400 years. His coronation by the Pope signaled a new era in European history. Charlemagne is crowned by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800. And again, by doing this, the West is showing that they're no longer going to rely on Constantinople or give deference to the emperor in Constantinople as the only emperor of this kind of Christian Europe, shall we say. The court of Charlemagne. Charlemagne means Charles the Great. He set up his court laws like unto Rome and sought to reestablish a new Western empire. This was, again, the idea of the trying to recapture the greatness of what had been Rome at the time and to set Europe and try and organize Europe and bring back some of the order and power and might and such that had been Rome in Europe. Das Heilige Römische Reich, or the Holy Roman Empire. A quick aside here is that the word Reich is very well known in those of the 20th and 21st century for the Third Reich, or Das Dritte Reich. What is the Third Reich? What are the first two? Well, this is the First Reich, Das Heilige Römische Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, or Reich. The Second Reich would be Das Deutsches Reich, which was the unification of Germany just before World War I. And then the third one would be Hitler's Das Dritte Reich, or the Third Reich. But this is the First Reich of which Hitler refers to when he says Third Reich. The First Reich here, the Second Reich, Das Deutsches Reich before World War I, and then again the Nazis. The empire was a valiant attempt to recapture what the Roman Empire was, but it was not the same thing. Heritage laws and family squabbles would plague it, plus administration would be a nightmare. Still, Europe had begun something that would endure. The Dark Ages, the sense of the chaos of which king and where and what, were officially over, and the High Middle Ages had begun, but it really would not see fruition for another 4 or 5 generations. One of the biggest problems plaguing the Holy Roman Empire was Frankish heritage law. In England, when a man is born into a noble family in Europe, say a duke or an earl, the first son is the earl, and no one else is anything really. He inherits everything, which is not to say that the younger sons can't get preference or privilege. Winston Churchill was a younger son of a duke, I believe, Duke of Marlborough, but he was not the duke, and so he had to make his own way. The Franks, every son got something, and were a whatever rank they were in the kingdom and such. So all of Charlemagne's nobles, each of their sons received something, which broke up this kingdom in rapid speed. So you can see the Frankish kingdom, which contained everything from France all through Germany, Italy, and into obviously still German, almost what we define as Poland. Very quickly would break up. The Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne put a lot of energy into the culture of his empire, from architecture to language and learning to military tools and training, Charlemagne sought to make the Holy Roman Empire the envy of other cultures. Alcuin of York, an Englishman, was brought in to teach and update the structure of learning. He introduced schools and updated the Latin script then in use. He created the Carolingian minuscule, or Uncial. This alphabet was much more readable than many of its predecessors and became the standard for the empire. What you're seeing here is documents coming from all areas, from Ireland and Scotland, from England, from France, from different peoples, and their style of writing was not consistent at all and became very difficult to read the manuscripts. Some of them, again, very old, some of them written with different kinds of quills and such. And again, it was very difficult to keep track of everything. This organized the writing style. Here's Alcuin of York, who was a Benedictine at the court of Charlemagne, presenting his book. And here is an example of the Carolingian minuscule, which you'll recognize right away as very similar to what we use nowadays in our writing. This made the Latin much more readable. He established some the grammar, what do you call it, commas and periods and things like that, and codified how to fit words into a sentence and things like this. Became the standard and default script of the Holy Roman Empire and then all of Western Europe. You can see the right-hand side how similar this looks to much of what we write today. Capital letters, words fitting on a page, and the like, became a much more readable and usable script. Back to the dynastic issues here, as I was saying, very quickly, the sons of Charlemagne and of his nobles each were portioned out apart, and the kingdom began to break up, and smaller kingdoms began to be formed, so that the unification which was originally imagined did not last. Furthermore, baronies, which is Germany was known for through much of its history, were for baronies and duchies, electors' duchies, and the dynastic struggles that happened over the various duchies of Germany is well known. Wittenberg, Saxony, Brandenburg, Mecklenburg, on and on. You can see the confederacy of these duchies, which was not what Charlemagne was hoping to have happen, but the heritage laws messed with it. Until finally, really, the kingdoms of France and Italy and such, and these areas become much more organized. Germany itself is rendered into a collection of duchies and will remain so until really the almost unification of Germany in the late 1800s. Coming from the Frankish kingdom that Charlemagne had initially imagined, to the collection of duchies was the single biggest weakness of the Holy Roman Empire. There were a number of strengths, and again, Europe really had a sense of itself now as a Christian kingdom under a king. And what Charlemagne began was to carry on and have fruit. However, the Holy Roman Empire itself was not the success they hoped it would be. The new evangelization. The days of St. Patrick, or Brendan the Navigator, and Hilda of Whitby are over. Evangelization is now an industry. Benedictine monks and nuns are sent to start monasteries in countries. Evangelization is no longer a discovery of a faith, but the acceptance of a structure. What you have now is with the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne was that the rule of Saint Benedict, the liturgy of Rome, that was the Benedictines were using, and the structure of religious life and such became default. And when you wanted to deal with Western Europe, you had to be Benedictine, and you had to adopt the liturgy of Rome. And this will later on cause numerous amounts of problems and eventually be one of the things that leads to the Reformation, this idea that you had to adopt and you had to assimilate what you were doing to that which what Rome did. And again, under the Pope and with the Benedictine structure in the Roman liturgy. But this is only the beginning of it. And right now, this actually becomes this machine which sends out monks and nuns into the various nations, actually becomes a very effective way. And the rest of Germany will be converted. Again, the Holy Roman Empire, but the rest of that area was not necessarily all all established and converted when Charlemagne took it over. It will be, as well as Scandinavia in the next century. It would also go into the east, which isn't under directly into the Holy Roman Empire, but you'll see that the rest of the world becomes Christian. And again, it does so by this machine, which is now Christian, and sends in basically almost like colonizers coming in, setting up monasteries, tilling the land, converting the peoples. It becomes an industry. The Pope sends out monks. These monks set up a foundation in a country. The country converts and submits to the papacy. It works, but it also creates problems. Again, you're going to see that many of the customs and such which were in place in the various countries are going to be suppressed, and conformity is imposed. And over the next centuries, this will cause problems in the various nations. You can see the monks here, the Benedictine monks, where everybody was Benedictine, and any other monastic rule or monastic structure had to be done away with, and it had to adopt Benedictinism. The unity of it, again, created great strength, but it also created problems in that many other old customs, which were much more ancient, had to be given up and done away with. Nuns also, you have Benedictine nuns going and taking off and setting up in areas, teaching young children, teaching young girls, influencing dynastic marriages, and making sure. And it really, again, it was a very good thing, because the many young girls were brought into monasteries and taught good Christian education, taught to read and to write, and the mothers of the wives and mothers of Europe were raised in these monasteries. Some of the ladies became nuns and continued on that, and some of them left and became wives and mothers. But they had this Benedictine training, which was an incredible means of Christianizing the society. All right. The next time we're going to go through is going to be the 900s. Christian Europe is our first major trend. As I say, this infrastructure that began with Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire is adopted, and this idea of coming in there, and really, if any of these nations, Scandinavia in particular, for example, wanted to trade and do such with Europe, they had to become Christian. Really, there wasn't an option. Everything was Christian. The language was Christian. Bishops were Christian, and pretty soon they're going to say, "We're not going to do business with you," or dynamic marriages. You know, the Viking king has his eye on a Christian princess, and they say, "Nope, you can't marry her unless you become a Christian." And many of them accepted baptism, and many of them became Christian. So Europe, the rest of Europe, is Christianized, which includes the evangelization of Scandinavia, Russia, and the rest of Germany. Also, more dynastic and monastic struggles. The monasticism is going to go through a huge growth, just monumental growth in its structure and organization. And you're also going to have some famous reform movements that step in, and they'll cover over the next 200 years. So I will end here. This is the end of the 800s. We'll see you next time for the 900s.